Welcome to Shorts in Psychology. Today we're going to go through the investigation structure. This will include explaining each step of conducting the investigation, as well as the sections of the report and what you need to cover in each of those sections in relation to the performance standards being assessed. Let's go through the investigation procedure. In the first lesson, we will go through the investigation itself, including the procedure and what data will be collected. You'll be given an information sheet describing this, and it's really important that you read through this before we conduct the investigation. You will also be given a consent form to sign and return should you choose to participate. It's important to be aware that although it isn't compulsory to participate, you will still have to write a proposal and investigation report and participate in the data analysis. Once the consent forms have been returned, you will receive an ID number and we will complete the investigation in class. After all of the data has been collected, it will be time to develop a research question. We will brainstorm some ideas in class, but ultimately it is up to you or your group to determine what your research question will be. Once you have your research question, you'll write your proposal. You will be given some class time to do this, but may need to finish it for homework. After your proposal has been drafted and approved, you can start analysing the data and generating your graph or graphs. Finally, you will be able to start writing your investigation report. This will be done predominantly as homework, but you may get some small fractions of class time here and there to work on it. Let's now look at each of the sections of the investigation report in more detail. The first step is to develop your research question. In the group investigation, you'll complete this stage with your team members and all use this same research question. In the individual investigation, you'll do this by yourself. It's important that you not only choose a question that interests you, but also one that isn't too simplistic. Otherwise, you will not be able to adequately address the performance standard KU1, as your ability to demonstrate a deep and broad knowledge and understanding will be limited in the analysis and interpretation of your data. Similarly, you don't want your question to be too complex, as this will cause your word count to be insufficient to analyse and interpret the data in adequate detail. Just remember, your research question and data type may vary depending on your research question, as this will influence what data collected from the investigation you will analyse. Also, don't forget that a qualitative report using the focus group transcripts is also an option, and this may be a great choice, particularly for those of you who are very articulate and less science-oriented. Once you've determined your research question, it's time to start writing your proposal. Your proposal should be between 200 to 250 words, and it's not included in the overall word count. Because the proposal has theoretically been written before we've conducted the research, it's written in present tense. So, for example, the aim of this SACE approved investigation is to. In the group investigation, the proposal should be identical for all group members. In the individual investigation, because you have written it independently, it will actually be graded. In the group investigation is merely drafted and you'll be given some feedback to use when developing the rest of your investigation report. Just remember, you will not be able to proceed to the data analysis stage until your proposal and research question have been drafted and approved. These are the key elements of the proposal. You need to clearly state your research question and the aim of the investigation. Then you need to describe the type of investigation design used, so whether it was an experimental, quantitative, observational or qualitative design, and the type of data that's been collected, as well as how that data was collected. So for example, subjective quantitative data was collected in the form of a rating scale used to measure an individual's commitment to not smoking. You then need to elaborate on how that data will actually be used to address the question and how it will be presented. So for example, mean heart rate scores will be presented in a bar graph in order to compare, etc., etc. You also need to clearly state what your hypothesis is. A common mistake made by students is that the sections describing how the data will be used and presented are either omitted or lacking detail, and this causes the rest of the report to really lack clarity and coherence. So make sure that you cover this in adequate detail while developing your proposal. This is the performance standard that is being used to assess your proposal. Develops logical, coherent, and detailed psychology investigation proposals. So again, make sure you cover all of those key aspects in a concise and scientific manner. Once your proposal has been drafted and approved, you'll gain access to the spreadsheet that contains the data we collected in the investigation, so that you can start analysing it. This is not a section of the report, it's simply the process that you're using to generate your results section. So if it's the group investigation, you'll be doing this with your team members. This means that all team members should have an identical results section in their final reports. In the individual investigation, of course, you'll do this by yourself. When analysing the data and calculating statistics, it's important to note that statistics such as standard deviation and median are optional and not required. In fact, I would only encourage you to calculate these statistics if they are genuinely adding something valuable to your discussion. It's very common for students to calculate a range of statistics, thinking that it makes their discussion look and sound better, when in actual fact all they do is list them without interpreting them, or they interpret them incorrectly. So only calculate statistics that you're comfortable being able to explain exactly what they mean. Okay, so we've conducted the investigation, you've chosen your research question, your proposal's been drafted and approved, and you've analysed the data. So now it's time to write your investigation report. This part, which is the 1500 word limit, is always completed individually. So while in the group investigation some of these sections will be the same for each team member, specifically the proposal and the results, the remainder of the investigation report, the introduction and the discussion, which is the bulk of your report, are to be completed individually. In the individual investigation, of course, all 4 of these sections have been done individually. Let's talk briefly about the differences between the introduction and the proposal, as this is often a source of confusion for students. The first difference between the introduction and the proposal is that, unlike the proposal, the introduction is written after the research has been conducted, so it should be in past tense. For example, the aim of this SACE approved investigation was to. Essentially, the introduction is a modified proposal. It has the exact same format as the proposal, and you can use this as your starting point, and then you just elaborate on a couple of things. So first of all, at the beginning of your introduction, you want just a couple of sentences about why the research is important. This isn't a literature review, but just from your own knowledge, your class notes, and your textbook. You also want to be slightly more detailed about how the data was collected, but again, it should only be an additional sentence or 2, because unlike the proposal, the introduction is included in your 1500 word count, so you really don't want to exceed 250 words at most. The next section of your report is your results section. Unlike the other sciences, no method section is included in the report. Investigation 4 is the performance standard against which your results section is assessed. So have your findings been recorded using an appropriate convention, i.e. the correct graph type, and have they been displayed accurately and highly effectively? Don't include raw data in the results section. Only include graphs of your mean scores. If you're discussing range and outliers in the discussion and want the reader to be able to refer to the raw data in a table, include it as an appendix. Make sure you don't have too many or irrelevant graphs and statistics. 1 to 2 graphs is generally sufficient, or a summary table following content analysis for qualitative reports. You also don't need to include a table of results as well as graphs. If you really want to show the actual mean scores, place them above each bar in your graph instead of also having a data table. I also can't emphasize enough the importance of having an appropriate scale. Excel especially likes to autocorrect axis scales, so watch out for that. Otherwise, you might be describing what looks like a significance between two groups that doesn't actually exist. You also need to have axis labels including units where applicable and a descriptive title. For example, rather than having a title called heart rate scores, it should include your independent and dependent variables, so the effect of the root of persuasion on heart rate. The discussion is the most important part of your report, and this should be the majority of your 1500 words. If you get to the end of drafting your report and you are not close to that 1500 word count, you do not have enough detail in your discussion. While it can be tempting to use subheadings to ensure that you cover all of the required aspects, try and avoid it because it can disrupt the flow of your discussion. You also need to be wary of repetition. Don't discuss the same points under different guises, for example, sample size, representativeness, and external validity. Instead, integrate your discussion and discuss those different concepts together to avoid repeating the same points over and over. Throughout your discussion, you should be evaluating the procedure and its rigor, rather than just generically defining concepts like validity and reliability. These are the two main performance standards that are being used to assess your discussion. So first of all, we have analysis and evaluation 3. So are you systematically analysing and evaluating your evidence, so your results section, to formulate both logical and highly relevant conclusions? This also applies to the rigour of the procedure. Are you evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of the procedure used and the conditions in which the investigation was conducted in a logical and relevant way? You also need to show a deep and broad knowledge and understanding of those range of concepts, which we'll go through in a bit more detail in a minute. So the first section of your discussion should be the data analysis. So there's no interpretation of the data in the results section. All of it is done here in the discussion. It's very easy for students to just list their values. For example, the central root of persuasion group had a mean heart rate of, the peripheral root of persuasion had a mean heart rate of. That is not data analysis. Anyone can look at your results section and read those values for themselves. So rather than just listing values, you need to interpret it in relation to the hypothesis. So what does that mean? So if the peripheral root of persuasion group had a higher heart rate, how could you explain that? What may have caused them to have an elevated heart rate in comparison to the central root of persuasion group? Does this support your hypothesis? Why or why not? If you have chosen to do other statistics such as standard deviation, you need to also discuss them here. So were outliers present in your sample? How have they impacted the mean? What was the range of each group? What was the highest score? What was the lowest score? Ultimately, all of your points need to link back to the research question and the aim of your investigation. And reread your paragraph. Make sure that it has good flow rather than it just being sentence after sentence of listing data. After discussing your data, you also want to talk about the sample size and representativeness. So as well as stating what your overall sample size was, you also want to be saying, well, how many participants were in each group? You also need to clearly identify your population, and you may want to discuss external validity here. So once you've said what your sample size is and your population, were there any types of bias present within your sample? Is it representative of your population? And therefore, how has this impacted external validity of the results? When discussing validity, remember to not just generically define them, but discuss it in the context of the investigation and procedure used. Consider how the data was collected and in what conditions. Was equipment used? Were any situational, participant or experimenter extraneous variables present that could have influenced the results? If there were, identify them and explain how they would have affected the results. To achieve at an A standard, it's really important to explain the how, rather than just listing extraneous variables that may have been present. As mentioned in the previous slide, I would discuss external validity with representativeness to avoid repetition of points relating to your sample. When discussing reliability, you need to consider whether you would expect the results to be consistent if the investigation was repeated with the same or a different sample. Again, give reasons as to why or why not. Looking at each class's data will be useful here, as you can treat it as a repeat with a different sample. You may have also identified some extraneous variables that lowered the internal validity of the results, which will also affect their reliability, so you can comment on this as well. You need to discuss at least 2 strengths and weaknesses of the investigation, and these should be specific to the procedure used and conditions on the day. Don't repeat points here, such as discussing sample size again as a weakness. Rather, you need to think of other aspects of the investigation to discuss as strengths and weaknesses. It is also important to point out that general investigation design or data type strengths or weaknesses, such as stating that using an experimental design is a strength as it gives greater control over extraneous variables, do not enable you to achieve an A standard. At best, generic strengths or weaknesses are evidence of achievement at a C standard. As you can see, improvements have their own performance standard, so they're a really important aspect of the discussion. If we have a look at the wording of AE2, you can see that it suggests a range of improvements, so only discussing 1 or 2 is not sufficient to achieve an A standard. As for strengths and weaknesses, I would also suggest you integrate these within your other paragraphs to avoid repetition. For example, when discussing the limitations of your sample, you could suggest an improved sample in terms of size and/or representativeness. The last part of your discussion is ethics. Again, they have their own performance standards, so make sure you have good coverage. In relation to users' ethical research practices, this standard also relates to your conduct in class during the investigation and data collection. While it's easy to reproduce the same basic ethical principles each time, such as informed consent and voluntary participation, it is really important that you discuss ethical issues specific to the investigation used. If your ethics paragraph can be copied and pasted into a different investigation report and still makes sense, it is not specific enough. You also need to ensure that you discuss both positive and negative ethical issues. To finish, you need a 1 to 2 sentence conclusion where you re-summarize your main points linked to the hypothesis. The last 2 performance standards assessed in your investigation report relate to its presentation and your communication. Are psychological terms used effectively, and do the different formats used, text and graphs, communicate knowledge in a coherent and effective manner? Make sure your report is written in formal scientific language. Don't write in first person. This means no I's or we's. Does the report flow well and is it easy to read? Make sure you don't have consecutive statements. Sentences need to flow on from one another. If a paragraph needs to be reread multiple times, it is lacking clarity. Make sure you also write concisely. More text doesn't necessarily mean you are saying more, and avoid repetition. I would highly recommend you have someone else proofread your draft for you, as when you are spending many hours writing and editing, it can be hard to detect repetition or lack of clarity. As you are rereading your work, ask yourself, is what I'm saying specific and relevant to this investigation, or am I generalizing? Hopefully these tips will help you ensure that you end up with a coherent and well-written report. So remember, be specific in relation to your research question and the procedure used. Be detailed and be concise. Thanks for listening. I hope it's been helpful. Good luck with the report writing.